Hi, this is Scott Bradfield, and this is we're on the chapter 7 of reading Ulysses in the bathtub as part of our series of reading great books in the bathtub. We're entering the chapter 7, which is the kind of satire on journalism in Ireland at the time, and probably of all time British and Irish journalism, and perhaps wider, but the only places I've seen journalism in operation, and the kind of the extraordinarily boozy, kind of incompetent, bloated. These are people who are paid by the word, and so they fill the pages up with words. And so it's a bunch of kind of hack journalists running around, usually getting drunk at 10 or 11 in the morning, or whatever time this is. We'll remind ourselves of some of the game plans for each chapter. Joyce sets up a chapter structure. Each chapter is very different, so we learn how to read that story. We learn, for example, to be in Stephen's point of view, close third person, seeing things, hearing his thoughts, beginning, middle, and end of the chapter, moving on to other chapters in Stephen's point of view, in which the language is different in some ways, and the thematic content is different, shifting to Bloom, where we're quite close into his head. And then in the last chapter, these first chapters are the far more conventional and structured, and to my mind, the best chapters in the book, and the less bloated. Now we're starting to get into, after the scene in the graveyard, where we have the point of view pulling back quite a bit from Bloom. We're not so deep in his head, deep in his thoughts, though near the end of it we come back into his head and we look and we imagine this world of death that Bloom imagines, with people, having photographs on their gravesite so they can still talk to people after they're dead and so forth. But for the most part, we're way back from Bloom. So even when Bloom walks out of the picture, we are still listening to Daedalus and the other people in the coach and at the service talking about Bloom. Then we come back into his head. So it's a different structure. We come into a different structure, and now from now on, he's going to be quite radical in the way he structures each chapter. This one starts in the heart of the Hibernian metropolis. These are kind of like headers on a newspaper. So we're going into a newspaper, which is the Freeman, I think it's called. There's 2 or 3 newspapers in the same building, I think. And we're getting these kind of chapter headings that pop up every paragraph or two to sort of announce the contents of the next passage. Many of the headers are as bloated and phony and as filled with fake erudition as most of these hack journalists are. I wanted to go through fairly quickly, if I could. One of the things I find fascinating about reading big books, and this, I don't like big books normally, is that our lives go up. Lives change, and if you're reading a book over 3-4 weeks, there are days you just don't care. And I have to say, we're getting into a chapter where I have less care, and there's some of the chapters that follow I'm less concerned with than I am with some of the more beautiful chapters that we've read. I think we've read some of the best of Ulysses, frankly. There's some great stuff coming up, but the best narrative stuff is in much of the best narrative stuff is in those first chapters. Okay, so one of the things let's think about, he's going to structure like he does all of these chapters. They're like little stories. They're really well structured chapters. And they're very disconnected in some ways. They're different experiments in telling the same story, or different segments of the same story across the course of the day. We start off with the vision of all the trams and all the transport running around Dublin. And we'll return to that at the end. And with all these trains and everything going, the newspapers going on in this chaotic fashion of this kind of mass communication, mass transport world of Dublin at this time, we have the kind of noise and chatter of all the gossip, lots of gossiping and political jokes of all the hacks in the scene that follows. Now we're going to follow through here where Bloom is going to show up, and we've got the we come into Gentlemen of the Press, and there's some lovely pictures of the large barrels of Guinness coming off the trucks to go into the pubs, and they're very nice. That the The descriptions: gross-booted draymen rolled barrels dull thudding out of Prince's stores and bumped them up on the brewery float. A great sense of sound in Joyce's sentences, and the bumping and the thumping of these huge barrels of Guinness, which are, in realistic terms, very well done, and in sort of metaphoric terms, obvious, because we're dealing with a bunch of drunks, really, when you get into the journals. Bloom is in there talking to a man named Red Murray. And I'll be honest with you, I keep forgetting. I read this chapter now twice in the past few weeks. And I forget who all these people are. But Bloom is basically goes around selling advertising. And he gets people to commit to advertising for the paper, and then he gets a commission. And he's trying to get someone named Alexander Keyes to run a series of ads or continue running some ads. And he's working out a deal with the newspaper to get Mr. Keyes some sort of free puff piece or a free puff a paragraph, P-A-R, paragraph. Something I'm constantly shouting at particularly my English students about paragraphs. The paragraph. So he's in there. He's talking to Red Murray, who I believe is a historical figure, a real person. I believe Joyce's wife worked for him. There's a lot of real people that are going to come in and out of this from Joyce's memories of Dublin, and then lots of historical characters. Now, he talks to him for a bit, and we're going to have a lot of images of the booze coming and going, and I don't want to go through all of this. The big shot editor walks past on 149, and he's talking. So he's talking to him, and there's a number, again, most of these headers are sort of ironic, how a great daily organ is turned out. And of course, then they sit around talking about booze and letters to the editor. And people start coming in. I don't want to go through all the little minor things because I don't think they're that important. A man named Hines shows up. A lot of these minor characters will keep coming back. He's being backed for Lord Mayor, Bloom notices, and he sees this guy named Hines come through, and he tries to remind Hines that Hines owes him money. Bloom does, and Hines doesn't quite get it. Everyone treats Bloom as if he's invisible. Now, he goes in to see Mr. Nanetti. We're talking about, there's a lot of talk between Bloom and the members of the press, or the people in the newspaper. And again, the two things that go round and round in this chapter are booze, the Guinness, they're all off at the pub at one point, and money, making money and selling advertising. So he's trying to sell for this Alexander Keyes has a tea, wine, and spirit merchant. And there's a lot of jokes in here about the Keys and the House of Keys, which have political references in Ireland. Forget it. He's trying to sell these. Don't worry about it. He's trying to sell this advertising for Mr. Keyes, and Mr. Keyes, very clever, wants 2 keys in the ad. So they're talking about that. And Bloom says he has to go off to get the design, and we're in Bloom's point of view. So, as I was mentioning, we're playing around quite a bit here for Joyce. We have Bloom in the beginning of the chapter, and we're hearing his thoughts. And then at one point, he's going to take off. He hasn't taken off yet, because next he goes in to see the hacks. There's a nice little point where I want to give one other thought here about how Joyce maintains time in his paragraphs. Quite briefly, on page 154. Bloom is watching the typographers and all the people working in the newspaper. And at one point, he's listening to the sound of the press. And the press, as the newspapers come sliding off the press, are going sult, sult, sult. And look how he works the sound of the press into the thoughts of Bloom to keep time moving in the interior thoughts. So it doesn't turn into, as it does in really bad writers, just degenerates into anything the writer wants to tell you. A nice little paragraph on 154. Sult. The nethermost deck of the first machine jogged forwards, its flyboard with silt, the first batch of quire-folded papers, silt. Almost human the way it silt to call attention, doing its level best to speak. That door, too, silt creaking, asking to be shut. Everything speaks in its own way. Soul. And there's Bloom's thoughts and his observations of the room intersected by the sound of the machine. Those are the sort of things that Joyce is always going to be looking for ways of keeping time moving in his fiction. And he's quite a prima donna, or quite a diva sometimes when he does these. And he watches the typesetter, and he meets a number of the people in the press. And eventually, he wants to go in and use the phone in Ned Lambert's office. And on 156, we sort of walk into a meeting between a Professor McHugh, who's a very pompous guy, Stephen Dedalus, Mr. Dedalus, Stephen's father, is in the room. And they're all reading a piece of pompous crap that's in that day's edition of the paper. It's filled with phrases like this. Or again, note the meanderings of some purling rill as it babbles on its way, fanned by gentlest zephyrs, though quarreling with the stony obstacles. And again, this type of overinflated, crappy prose that filled up Irish discourse and Irish politics and Irish newspapers is being lampooned through here. At one point, Bloom asked, "What are you guys reading?" And Mr. McHugh, to make a joke on Bloom, he says, "It's Cicero's Discovered Lectures." Now, when he says that, we have no idea as readers who they're quoting. We are in the scene with Bloom, so we don't know as we start to find out. And you have to have a good memory. This is a man named Dan Dawson, some political hack who edits a transcript of a speech that he gave the day before. And later on, they refer to him as Doughy Daw because he used to run a bakery. So Doughy Daw. Now we continue on with a lot of kind of chatter about the ridiculousness of this terrible speech, and Bloom is running around trying to basically get through and get the newspaper. Okay, and he has to stand around kind of awkwardly with all these people in the room. He goes off on page 162. Just a moment, Mr. Crawford, he said, "I just want to phone about an ad." He went in. What about that leader this evening? So now, again, we have Bloom leave the room, and we stay in the room. It's almost like the camera has come in with Bloom and then stayed there while he left. These types of certain dislocations are not hard to follow, but you do need to watch out for them because you'll start to forget who's thinking. They start talking about a race. There's a dead cert for the Gold Cup. The bet on the race is going to keep coming up during the book. And at one point, Bloom goes away and walks out to go off to do some more work on this ad. I think he needs to go see Keyes. And at that point, Stephen shows up on 167. Let me see where he shows up. Yes. So in the middle of 167, most of the people in the place, particularly Stephen's father, go off for a drink. And then Bloom comes and goes. And we're not really in a point of view. It's like we're almost watching the scene like a play. And there's a lot of theatrical qualities to this whole scene. There's a lot of dialogue, a lot of comic dialogue, and a lot of people coming and going. And then after everyone's gone, Stephen shows up. And it says Stephen Dedalus behind him, uncovered as he entered. So now we got to look for that when he shows up, because we're going to very quickly come into to Stephen's point of view. So for the next few pages, we'll be seeing and hearing things as Stephen thinks them. There's some jokes that go on. Stephen's here to bring Mr. Deasy's letter about foot and mouth disease for the newspaper. So he's brought that. Bloom and him pass in the hall, basically, at this point. And Bloom finds him interesting. Mr. Garrett Deasy. And again, there's a lot of sort of references. Once we start getting into Stephen's point of view, it's always my least favorite to some extent, his interior stuff. He's so important. It's so important to sound so clever and makes so many references to so many historical figures in almost everything he thinks. He's pretentious even in his own head. And then there's a lot of talk in this about various journalistic personalities, a famous court case, people who spoke well. They like to talk about, like, there's some lawyer who was a murder case, and they talk about all these great orators. There's a lot of talk about orators by a lot of really clumsy speakers. And the people they're talking about really sound like they're full of bullshit. So it's a lot of people with talking bullshit about other bullshitters is what it's called. That's the joke of it. It's too long. This is one of the chapters where the joke is just manufactured and extended far longer than it should be. There's some wonderful little bits in it, and it's too long. Okay, so I'm going to skip through a lot of this. There's a lot of gossip on real people, but the main thing to know is that you're with Stephen at this point, and he's talking to J.J. O'Malloy, I believe, and then they mentioned somebody named A.E., the Master Mystic, and he's a real historical figure who will come into the book off and on throughout the book. Finest displays of oratory. I'm going to skip through a lot of this. They read another. Then Stephen makes up on page 180 a speech he heard by a famous person. I forget which one it is now. And he starts making up a lot of bullshit here about somebody who he claims he heard some final speech by them. And then we're going through Dublin, and then they want to go off to get a drink. Then before Bloom comes back, Stephen starts to tell a story. This is one of my least favorite parts of the chapter. 184. He starts to tell what he calls a parable of two old women who climb the Nelson's pillar. And it's a long-winded joke with a real super clever ending, which I really could care less about. It goes on for a long time. 185, Bloom returns, and there's a racing special everyone's going on. There's kids, there's the newsboys, by the way, who are coming and going, these big fleets of newsboys running around. And they're all excited because the racing edition's coming out. They're trying to sell it. And whenever Bloom comes or leaves, they're always trying to sell him the papers. That's why these kids are following him all the time. It doesn't quite make sense otherwise, but that's why they're all following him. And there's just a lot of noise around him. Now, here's 186. It's one of the first times that Bloom notices Stephen. I mean, he sees him and he's known him around town before. And he kind of admires him as a smart kid who went to college. And, of course, he thinks of Rudy, his own son who's dead. And he's a little nostalgic of the potential fatherhood he could have had. 186, under the chapter title, KMA, Kiss My Ass, Kiss My Arse, we're in Ireland. And he thinks when he sees the boy, wonder is that young Daedalus, the moving spirit, has a good pair of boots on him today. So he notices Stephen. They're going to become friends, or they're going to spend time together later in the book. So that's the first time they sort of get to know each other. Stephen's long-winded story is very clever, very boring. He keeps interrupting. It keeps going on and on. Everyone forgets him and goes off chattering, and then he keeps bringing it back up. And the joke is about Nelson only having one arm and being an adulterer, and it's based on some historical information. And it's not worth the trip as far as I'm concerned. What's more important to me is this sort of snotty tone that Stephen takes with everybody. And then one of the only things that Professor McHugh says to him is pompous as well. He compares Stephen to Antisthenes. He says, you remind me of Antisthenes, in this kind of pompous professorial way. And he says, none could tell if he were a bitterer against others or against himself. And for once, somebody seems to nail Stephen a bit. He is bitter. And he's almost everything he thinks and sees is filled with a bitterness about the world he sees and about him seeing it. There's a lot of self-contempt in him. Now, again, one of the nice things about Joyce is he always finds different ways to structure these chapters, and we come to the end of it, and now we come back to the Nelson's column with all the different trains, where all the trains meet. It's like this hub where all the trams cross and all these different communication systems intersect. So we come back there. He finishes his stupid joke with a ending which I can't understand. I'd have to look that up, and I don't care what it's about. And finally, they go off to have a drink. I think they're basically going off to have a drink. And Bloom is still off on his job. I forget where the point he's at now. He's still working on this Keys advertisement. So it's a long chapter. It's too long. Many of the chapters from now on are going to be too long. I really feel this strongly. He's starting to get really a little over impressed with himself, Joyce, and the things he can do, and he's forgetting some of his prime narrative points that he's made. And these new set pieces are delivered in much more elaborate ways. Sometimes, in incredibly unconventional and surprising ways. But it is a little more slow going from now on. Okay, that's chapter 7, and next tomorrow or later in the week, we'll do the next chapter back into Bloom's head, and it has to do a lot with eating. Just all these people eating. It's kind of disgusting in parts. Okay, see you soon. Bye.